Thanks for inviting me. This was one of these ones which was very carefully arranged months in advance to make sure it would happen. And as was said earlier, obviously a lot of water, in a sense, has passed under the bridge since the invitation back in March or April. So in a sense, I think the interesting part of today is that not only have we got a system, which obviously clearly still has a long way to go in terms of being a fully useful tool, but that tool is now potentially up for review immediately, which I think is a good thing. And I think just to confirm what Esther said, certainly the work we did picked up on work that had been done, dating all the way back through the 80s and 90s, but particularly since the formation of the GLA, a lot of good work had been done. We were able to pick that up in order to do the work we did during 2004-2005. And probably the best bits that come out of that, and what I'd really like to try and get across today, are some sort of ideas on how one can manage, what the concepts are that might be involved in running a modern view management policy. And hopefully those policies, with whatever review is, whatever fine-tuning is needed, can then withstand the idea of then being looked at from a different development climate and so on. Because again, it was only when I really saw the returns, I knew exactly who was coming and exactly the interest. I'd obviously put this together with sort of a slightly sort of broader concept, but I'll try to sort of keep it as focused as we can now. First of all, just a little bit about why I'm here, what we do. Miller Hare as a company is involved a lot in views issues in London. The bit I just wanted to make clear, because I think probably people see bits of what people like us do, just a quick overview of the sorts of things that touch onto the planning process. Here's a view to be managed. This is the South Bastion view of London Bridge. A thing that possibly in planning departments people don't see so much, but is the stage that we get involved with earliest, which is sort of issues about trying to understand the existing shape of the city, and particularly the evolving shape, the notion of consents. Now, this is a slide obviously provided sort of done a while ago for a particular purpose at a moment when the building on the right obviously is not any longer in contention, fortunately. What I'm just doing now, you can barely see it, just flicking on and off at the middle of let's go back. The middle of the screen there is the bit that's changing, is the bit that this study was all about, which was essentially, I think it's a project I can now talk about because I think it's fairly dead in the water in this form at the moment, but this was the redevelopment of the Port of London Authority as a hotel, and one of the issues was about roof form on a building that was, a very important historic building, also part of the setting of the World Heritage Site, but clearly it's got a backdrop of some very, very tall buildings, and what was being tested here were very subtle changes in roof form. So this sort of idea of doing sort of three-dimensional studies to understand projects and sort of find out constraints and so on, that's part of the work that people like us get involved with. The next bit is really then the idea, which again I think people are fairly, in this room are obviously very used to, as it were, the most factual bit, in a sense, that people like us are asked to do independently of the design teams, is to be able to just, in this case, accurately say where a building is and how big it is, visually how big it is. Again, hope I haven't made this one again should be dead in the water. This one was a competition entry for a project on the Albert Embankment. It's not one that's actually in contention at all, so don't anyone get alarmed about it. It was, it just happened to be a series. What I was realising was the more modern stuff I had was generally stuff that was in contention, therefore I probably couldn't show it. But anyway, this sort of notion here, this is, in the terminology of the London View Management Framework, what is called an accurate visual representation, now compressed to AVR, a bit of a mouthful, and this one is called the AVR Type 1, which means that all it is trying to do is to convey to people the size and location of a building. It's not trying to discuss anything about its impact, its visual appearance. It is going, the reason that makes it an AVR 1 rather than an AVR 0, which is technically in the framework, is these dotted lines. Because the one thing it is trying to say is which bits of this building, were it to be built, would be visible and which other ones would not be visible, or in the jargon would be occluded. The word occlusion keeps cropping up in these terms. Anyway, so that sort of notion of doing a series of views to test the position of a building, and these are obviously here against LVMF viewpoints. And then really the stage beyond that, which again I'm sure to some extent impacts, everybody here again would see it as part of planning, but it also goes on through planning, or in this case sort of pre-application, I would say, because this is public consultation. The idea of trying to produce visual images that convey architecture and urban design to people. So this one here really is, this is a very putative thing. In this case, the client body is the group of local authorities. But this was a series of images about the scheme for Exhibition Road and how that might be transformed into a shared vehicular pedestrian surface. Anyway, so this is the idea of using computer graphics to sort of convey the stuff that doesn't really come off plans. And because of the work that, because of the way that companies like ourselves work, and this I think is a change that's happened over the last 4 to 5 years, and to some extent it is one of the smaller bits that's in the LVMF, is to try and make people who see this sort of work clear in their mind what exactly they're being presented here. Are they being presented something that is can be relied on as an accurate representation of something, and that's this AVR term, or potentially some of these images could simply be to illustrate a design concept. They could be a way, just as an architect sketches or produces models, they could be a way of trying to communicate an idea. Because our work very often is planning, we tend to try very hard not to get involved with ones that could be confused as being AVRs without them being accurate. But accuracy in a picture like this is generally about accuracy of geometric things, where things lay, how big they are. As you move on to the representation of materials, and in this case the representation of sort of human life, you've obviously moved into an area that's much, much more subjective. But there's some attempt in the LVMF, in the technical appendix, to try and draw that to some sort of terminology. I think that's just sort of slowly starting to take roots. As these projects proceed, I just wanted to illustrate 2 different things. The first one was to try and sell an idea before the design work had actually really been done. This is the end of the product, of the process. This is obviously just over here when Bankside was just starting to come out of the ground. And these are really the selling images. And these are the ones which there has to be some caution with about the difference between this and what we would term an accurate visual representation. The trick, the thing that you can't easily perceive looking at this, is that this is a perspective that could not be taken as a photograph in the street. That the perspective of this building, the way it sits and looks, requires the camera to be further away than the width of a street. So it's quite a valid document because it tells what the design intent is, and to some extent, because of the way we look at buildings and scan around them, it might be quite similar to what we would have in our head when we walked away. But this is the thing you couldn't put a photograph side by side with, because there isn't a place to stand to take this photograph. We're way inside another building. So that's saying going beyond AVRs into things that are just more representational. And then this is the sort of thing that then our work then goes on to, which is to try to, typically in our case, we try to work on projects through their length. So having got a planning permission, in this case, for 4 or 5 different organisations, the developer comes along and says, now can you bring this building to life for this particular organisation? This was actually IPC who then subsequently took the building. This is another one that's been a lovely project like that to work on. This one, this is the King's Cross, King's Place development that's just now finished, and will soon be opening as an amazing venue. But these again are to explain the content of a project. Slightly different one here because this was done so meticulously and carefully by its whole design team that by the time we were doing the computer graphics, we knew everything about what this building was going to look like. There was nothing really artistically. I mean, the challenge was just to make it look right, really. Okay, so moving now quickly closer in. From all of that stuff, the way that we have tended to work as a company is that we try to keep going the data that we build up as we work on projects. So over the last, I suppose actively over about the last 10 or 12 years, we've just been keeping the models that we build in a common three-dimensional framework so that it's always possible to switch on projects and see them side by side. Most of the model, as that I'm showing you here, is the stuff that's actually in white generally, is looking at today. And the model is basically structured in a way that, because of the sort of work we do, it breaks the city down into zones. And those zones, we start with quite big ones, but as people start working on areas, those zones progressively subdivide. And they subdivide down to the point at which somebody could acquire a site and then put buildings onto it. And then once buildings get started, then it's possible then to switch them on and off, look ahead 5 years, 10 years. Interestingly, occasionally, we also go backwards. We've done a few little bits of work with the Museum of London. We've just done a project for the Royal Academy where you could run the same site backwards in time rather than running it forwards in time. And I mean, longer term for models like this, particularly the archaeology things are very, very interesting because it's a very good way, because archaeology builds upwards, of sort of understanding how cities work. So using a computer model like this, it then becomes possible to do quite quickly the initial stuff that I was showing at the beginning of the presentation, essentially people wanting to do what-if scenarios. So this here is the idea. I'm standing at the Gabriel's Wharf viewing platform and looking ahead at, and the stuff in pink is the currently consented schemes. Because it's a model, you can more quickly do things like move around, check what would happen in another part of a viewing area, switch buildings on and off and test things, as it were. So here we are, we're sort of zooming in. I mean, and this is one of those issues that, again, if there's work to be done again on the LVMF, should be reviewed. When the work was done, the work I'm talking about was done, we were asked from the London Plan general guidance about views from the South Bank to identify the really sort of critical ones that were going to be managed at the GLA level, sort of not at all impinging on what the boroughs were doing below that. Picked the Gabriel's Wharf viewing area, and during the course of the work that was going on, as you can see, a building was consented in this view, which if you go and stand at this view now, you see that indeed the Broadgate Tower sits just to the right of the cathedral. The timing of this, its consent, was just the same time as the public consultation ended on it. There's a perfectly good answer to Gabriel's Wharf, though, which is to just slightly move the viewing point. And one of my great puzzlements in all the work I did over the last 4 years was nobody ever came back and said, why don't you move the viewing point from here to here? That there was some sort of strange, there's a sort of strange way when we talk about this, about which bits people cling on to very firmly and which bits people like to argue about. Obviously, again, what models let you do is very quickly then to sort of compare what you're seeing by going up. So here you can see a pink shape here. Well, that's the profile of the new new change. There's a building on site here just south of St Paul's, which took down a building that was within the St Paul's heights and took it down below it. So you can see this view this particular view of St Paul's is very similar to what the objective of St Paul's Heights was trying to do in 1936 or so, about sort of giving sort of clear sight lines to the corners of the cathedral. A good way of seeing that is, again, through models. You can try to, anything that you could try to get numerically, you can start to build computer models of. So this is a computer model of St Paul's Heights, and you can see you can see basically how the development has all worked, with people trying to sort of skim themselves as close as they can. And then the sort of the major buildings here, like the Faraday House of 1930s, early 1930s, which was one of the buildings that triggered St Paul's Heights, being one of the sort of the major ones that goes through. And obviously the bit that's being, as you'd expect, being managed, the Wren spires sticking through. So that's a bit about the work we do, and I guess why we were very keen to get involved with the London View Management Framework. I had intended here just to show you one other thing, which I think you can just take for read, but if there's time I can show anyone on the computer. I just wanted to also explain one of the things you can do quite well with computer models is moving views, the concept of walking across a bridge and understanding kinetically what actually happens to things as they move past each other. So we'll skip that. So what I'm now just going to try and do is, I didn't take the brief quite as literally as being, at the end of this you would know everything you need to know about the London View Management Framework. But any questions anybody's got, I'll try to help. What I'm going to try to do is to explain why I think it is the way it is, and what happened well along the way and what perhaps didn't happen so well along the way. So back to now, if you like, 2004. So the GLA, having put the main policy issues into the London plan, then needed to really put some more specific information to go with it. And that was the work that Esther was doing in-house up to about the point you left at about the time I think our project started. So it went out to consultants to make tenders, and people from different areas applied. Urban design professionals applied, planning professionals applied, but I think we probably got the job because there was a sort of realization that in the middle of this, some of it was geometric and needed to be done with quite a lot of precision, and therefore using a visualization company was quite good. We didn't feel we had enough expertise on the heritage and some of the townscape issues, so in turn we then brought in one of the townscape consultants to work with us, who was Richard Coleman, who I'm sure a number of you know. So again, just to say, using a model to do this sort of work, and sorry, I did this rather late last night and get the resolution of the picture exactly right, so some things are just bouncing through there. But anyway, this is RPG 3A as it was then. You know, as we know, just a protection system for narrow views across London. There'd been an intention announced in the London plan that those views were going to be reviewed and narrowed, and part of the remit to us was to define what those dimensions might be. So I think everybody was expecting this. What perhaps our client, the GLA, wasn't expecting so much was the view we came to was that the narrowing of the corridors was acceptable in certain situations. You know, whether we got the numbers exactly right, but there's certainly certain situations where that was appropriate, because a lot of the very long distance views are simply about recognition. They are about being able to preserve the ability for people when they take their kids up there to say that is St Paul's or whatever. I mean, it is there is an aesthetic experience, but the aesthetic experience is a very big one, and therefore the views themselves these things can't quite manage them. What, though, is under much more dynamic threat, and also to some extent is where London is now seen most importantly, both by Londoners and visitors, is views from the centre of London out, and particularly views along the river, so crossing the bridges and various of the embankments. What's interesting is when you start to study these in 3 dimensions, is that a different sort of form arises from them. These things, which are flying in from Blackheath and Greenwich, because London's a dish, they are things that have eye points that are quite high, 50 metres, 60 metres, 70 metres, and so on, different hills. And they're looking at St Paul's, and there's a target point for reference, that's the base of the drum of supporting the peristyle, and that's at 52 metres. So depending on which of these ones you're in, these views are either slightly up or slightly down views, but they tend to sort of cut sort of corridors through London. Views from the river are very different, because if you're crossing a bridge, you're at 10 metres, say 11 on Hungerford, you might be 15, 16 metres on Waterloo Bridge, different heights for the other bridges. And particularly if you're on an embankment, you might be at 5 or 6 metres above datum. So if you're looking at a thing that's 56 metres high and relative to Greenwich, much closer to you, a kilometre away or 1.5 kilometres away, the angle of sight is a much more sharply raking thing. So although these were using some of the same ideas as the distant ones, they were very different for a different reason, which is that they were views that look up, which means that, particularly once you're in the background of the monument, buildings can start to get pretty high before they even fall into consultation. Now, I know, looking back on the work we did, that was the thing that was definitely missed by everybody. We didn't produce the graphics that convinced everybody, not least the mayor, that this was a system that was able to allow a lot of the London Plan objectives of development and regeneration to happen. If you look at this thing from the top, it just simply looks like it is a no development policy. But it's very difficult to get across in this sort of thing that a 100-metre high building over here is completely invisible. Well, not even invisible, is below a consultation threshold, let alone invisible. You know, there's a long way to go. Anyway, so we'll see in a second as I just take you through the history of it. So anyway, this was the process that evolved in the work we were doing. A bit later, that particular series of concepts was dispensed with by the GLA. And therefore the thing that we have to use today is back to a thing that looks a lot more like RPG 3A again, if you see it as a map. It's the only thing you can easily map is the vistas. It's not that that's the whole of the system, but it's the easiest thing for everyone to conceptualize are these protected corridors. The only thing of note is that just towards the end of 2006 was then the reintroduction of one additional one of these protected vistas, which is the City Hall vista, meaning that the system that's now in the LVMF has got 11 protected vistas. And for my part, back to the thing about saying that this is partly about a conceptual framework that then can get adjusted and fine-tuned, I'm very, very happy that there was one more, because it meant that we hadn't gone nowhere. We'd introduced a concept which is somehow sort of lodged in this one vestigial thing. And I'll come back to that in a second. Right, so what I want to do now just is very quickly just whiz you through the work and just get to some discussion points at the end. So as I mentioned, the policies of the LVMF are part of the London Plan. So that's that's not LVMF, that is the plan itself, and obviously that's gone through reviews and examination in public. Similarly, the list of views is in the LVMF. So when people say, oh, well, why isn't there a view from this place to here? Well, that was, as it were, an earlier discussion. But at this level, London Plan review, that is the point at which this could obviously return. The LVMF was obviously intended to create greater clarity. I mean, that was the intention, and perhaps we return to that. And those sort of two things go together. 2004 was the end of a sort of a long bruising period for both various local authorities, English Heritage, GLA, people just spending a lot of money on public inquiries as being the only way, apparently, to be able to resolve views policy. And there was sort of lurking at the back of it was some notion, which again I think would be good to discuss in a second, about there being, this was about the strategic, the cross-borough, the national important views, but there's lots more to views policy than that, and ideally, in the most optimistic way, the LVMF would mesh very well with local policies. Okay, our work effectively started in March 2004. There was a background study, there was a stakeholder consultation. There's various people in this room who we came to see. The boroughs were the main stakeholders, really. Numerically were the main stakeholders. They were the most people that were consulted. I think there was an attempt to speak to everyone who had a who had a view originating in their borough. I'm not sure if it was if they had one who crossed it, but either had a monument or had an origination. So there was a sort of a reasonable cross sample of the boroughs, English Heritage, Royal Parks, and the World Heritage Management groups were the people that were consulted with. That led to a development period between about September and December 2005. A document went into production March 2005, and it went out to public consultation April 2005 and back to which ended in July 2005. Since that's all sort of slightly water under the bridge, it's just that obviously this is the bit I can talk about most authoritatively, and because of potential for review, there is maybe some of the earlier work that's worth revisiting. What happened after that public consultation was there was an internal period when the document was very heavily reviewed in the light of public consultation, consultation responses. And during that period, the LVMF changed direction slightly. The point I'd like to make about the public consultation had been a very enjoyable and very good interactive session period when lots of ideas had been shown and then discarded from comments and so on. And by the time it went out to public consultation in 2005, it wasn't at all that I was expecting a soft ride, but I thought we had got to a point of some reasonable level of consensus, that there was a need for such a policy and that the conceptual ideas were okay. What I was fully expecting was lots of comments about this point should be over here, this view should have been managed in this way, not in this way. What the public consultation responses were about was a lot of public concern about one view in particular, which is the King Henry's Mound view, and then a lot of pretty misinformed information from developers who just, and I think particularly egged on by their planning consultants, because nobody seemed to understand it, that any change, any regulation was anti-developer. And that stuff to me took root very strongly in the GLA in this particular period, with a result that by October 2005, some decisions had been taken that included abandoning any concept of any geometric protection for any parts of the river prospects, an insistence on everything being managed by what was termed qualitative visual assessment, but what was that in itself would have been fine, except that simultaneously all descriptive material that was in the draft to say why a view was important was taken out. So it was qualitative visual assessment, but with no guidance to anyone really as to what you were trying to assess, I suppose. So at that point, myself and Richard Coleman resigned from the job and said we couldn't put that revised framework into it was too different from the one that we had gone out and consulted with and won a certain degree of consensus, we believed. So we left the job. A new consultant team was appointed. Development continued through 2006. Kept on thinking it would be there. Oh, by the way, we fully expected to be out by Christmas. So our target was finish consultation. There were some really good more comments, fine-tune it all for 3 months, and go back into production, finish it by Christmas 2005. That was slower than we'd been asked to. I think we'd have taken 15 months against what was seen initially as we tendered for a 4-month job, and that would have taken 15 months. But that would have been December 2005. Anyway, it seemed to go rather slowly, kept on being deferred. What then happened, as I'm sure everybody again is aware, that things all got heated up a little bit more by the inspections by ICOMOS. That started to bring central government into play, leaning on the GLA, saying they definitely did not want delisting of World Heritage sites. And there was a response within the document, which was the reintroduction of one additional protected vista. And some additional words about World Heritage sites. At this point, for my sins, I did get back involved, and I was asked in the early part of 2007 to define a revised set of directions for the vistas. This time, essentially, it was working for Government Office for London. these went out for consultation at about that time. There was then some changes made, which I'm not fully clear on, but anyway, some further changes were made. And then in due course, the LVMF was issued. Now, so the most important thing I really just wanted to try to leave everybody with here, what both our document and to a certain extent the final document tried to do, was to see if we could think of a series of terms, if you like, concepts that professionals, applicants, planning professionals and so on could agree on a sort of series of terminologies that they could use to talk about things. And therefore people would understand in a common parlance what sort of rules that they were working within and how they should respond. So the conceptual framework in my mind is different from A, the list of views, which will change as things change, and B, a lot of the specifics of the views. As new buildings get built, various locations, numbers will change. But what we were hoping was that the conceptual model would survive. Okay, right at the very top is a thing which was very difficult because the London plan talked about views when sometimes those were very obviously a view, like King Henry's Mound, and sometimes they were a very, very big area, like Waterloo Bridge, where you see all sorts of different things in all sorts of different directions. So there had to be a word for viewing place, and that's now, in the current draft, is now called a designated view. For reasons that I quite understand, the new authors decided they liked the word viewing place, which is a more empathetic term for this thing that we called a location. What this was trying to do was to say that a lot of these views are not static points like General Wolfe's statue or particularly King Henry's Mound or Westminster Bridge. They are a section of crossing Westminster Bridge, or Westminster, I mean any of the bridges, certain sections of the South Bank. And therefore they're places that A, could have a geographic spread to them, and B, quite often are experienced in movement rather than static things. So you need a way of defining those, and those seem to us to be the place where you would also attach much of the historical information and much of the sort of values of the view, because they would describe things that you would see over quite a broad area. However, in order to bring about any way of allowing particularly planning authorities to be able to have a chance of assessing inflowing developments, we realised that there was a bit of geometry that we think is quite important, which is that as a starting point within one of those viewing locations, you can generally pick a couple of spots that are particularly good because you see either monuments well defined in sky or you see a lot of other monuments. They're particularly strong points. And if you encourage people to go and stand at those points, then if you get two different applications coming in, there's a chance that you can actually compare what's going on between these two things. And it provides a sort of common parlance to do it. So within viewing locations, we had this concept of there being significant views, some of which were quite narrow and some of them are necessarily broader because of the shape of where you're standing. So tied to a significant view, once you could say, well, this is the place that you can see this view from best, you can then talk about a three-dimensional point in space, which was the term assessment point. And this term does seem to have sort of lodged. And if you can publish those assessment points accurately, then people can, architects, engineers, people like us, can provide tools and work on tools that make assessment more precise than relying purely on accurate photomontage. Once you've got one of those significant views, though, in some cases, the view of a particular monument is so special that you don't really want to leave it to just chance of different people assessing, does this hurt the view or does it not hurt the view? That in some cases, it would be, we believed, it would be well advised to actually define geometrically what you mean, so that there's a sort of, and it is my contention that developers want that as well. They would actually like to know that up to this line they're going to be in one regime, and as they cross this line they are into a completely different regime, and they can plan their costs accordingly. So those are the conceptual models. These are some slides I dug out, and you can see from November, this was being presented back, this was sort of halfway through that refinement process. So it isn't the final document, it's not the final graphics, but it sort of shows where they were. It proposed at this point, and most of this has survived through into the final thing, that there would be, for the thing called Waterloo, there would be some history of the bridge, some of the special things about it, any management policies about access, disabled access, all things like that. But the meat of it comes once you can actually get to an area where you can define a view and talk about the things you can see in that. So, for example, here you've got the upstream side of Waterloo Bridge. Suddenly there's a whole sequence of things that can be talked about, and you can write guidance on that view, and that guidance is intended to apply across the view itself. Then, as a way of illustrating the view, partly because the document's got to be portable and be used, but also as this way of leading people to, when they go on site visits, to go and stand at sensible places that they will be able to see the optimum number of the things that are being talked about. The idea within those things of assessing what we term significant views, some of which could be represented by a single photograph, sometimes by a panorama. The bit I think I feel most sad about is that our photographs in the final document, somebody with a pair of scissors sort of jammed them together in the most sort of cack-handed way. So it's not a very lovely result from these photographs. The same photographs, incidentally, they weren't reshot, which is a bit annoying. So once you've done that, you can repeat that process here. So this is talking about Waterloo Bridge, identifying particular sort of sweet points across it where you can understand the key factors. And then in situations where a particular view, and this was obviously a highly contentious view that was the subject of the Heron inquiry, the notion of saying, well, how close should the central cluster get to St Paul's, and try to put some geometry on that so that people on plan can understand. They see this line going across a map and know that on one side of it they're going to be struggling to build a 15-story building, and on the other they might be building an 80-story building. Okay, the document as developed introduced this idea of saying outside of geometry it is now back to these sorts of issues. I won't go into those in great detail, but those are the sorts of factors which particular viewing locations should have quite clear guidance on. Particular strengths about the views. Sometimes pointing out that a view is a very good view from a place that people like to be towards a monument, but actually some new development could actually help it. There's quite often views where there's impaired things, so sometimes development opportunities is a thing that could be talked about. And then some information really about the terminology, which I hope is everybody does feel comfortable with. This is the one bit which is well defined, although clearly the last item, the fourth item, the backdrop advisory line, I won't skip over that. That was another one that was dropped in the change of policy. But this basically it's just a way of talking about what. This is just a way of illustrating what the terms that were defined by the London Plan and then picked on by this point, developed by the LVMF. So it talks about viewing corridors that were the most protected foreground elements, lateral assessment areas, which to all intents and purposes are the same, in as much that any development inside these lateral assessment areas that breaks through this plane is a subject of very high scrutiny and is likely to be objected to. The only difference between it is that whereas in the centre the assumption is that rigorous shaving off of buildings would take place, that nothing would ever break that line, in the outer areas there would be a little bit more of the ability where you could allow a building to develop the form it wanted to be, not to do what we're very conscious of is the effect that 100% geometric planes do, which St Paul's Heights do, of buildings that get shaved off at funny angles. So the idea that a building might have a turret or in this view, the Old Bailey pokes through. Were the equivalent. If we were building a Courts of Justice here, could you put something on the top of it that broke through the plane? And then a background consultation area, which is a way of triggering the sort of scrutiny that would ultimately protect the silhouette of things. I think there's a strong implication from the London plan forward and the two versions of the LVMF that this wasn't a development plane, it was a consultation plane, but still, you know, some very strict rules to be applied to it. The only thing that's being illustrated here is that these close-up views, it seemed very logical that the close-up views should be themselves congruent with St Paul's Heights, so there was some shaving off there. Anyway, that's just make sure you've done the illustration. So just two more slides now, just to sum up to where I think we are now. The LVMF, as it currently comes out, I mean, I think one of its weaknesses is that there was a public consultation, but a lot of the things that came up in the public consultation, outside of those very hot areas I talked about, there were some good ideas buried in the public consultation, and they didn't somehow get through. So there's a problem, I think, there. There's been some success in standardising assessment points, and that sort of hopefully stops to bits the idea that two developers come along with perspectives that are 15 feet apart. There could be some sort of balanced thing, and it also makes it a bit quicker and more direct for people to make sure they have checked the right places. I think there's a lot of confusion regarding the purpose of the views. There was a determination not to put any, there was a fear of geometric protection. In the final draft, anything that indicated where a view was looking was removed. There's a rather crude thing called a direction of view. But the effect of that is that the assessment points are now starting to be thought of as 360-degree markers, which they were never considered to be. They were assessment points that were derived from views. They replaced a stand to look at a view, not as we're now being asked to do, if I'm on one side of Waterloo Bridge, to produce a perspective spinning around looking across the traffic into Lambeth. That wasn't the reason why the view was put there. So the idea of 360-degree views, that's a real confusion that's cropped in. This is definitely a fault that was right there back to the original draft and certainly didn't get corrected, is moving views was not handled correctly, and I think still hasn't been correctly handled. It was raised to a lot of visibility by the developers and their submissions talking about moving views, but what they meant was they didn't want any fixed assessment points because there'd always be a place that was better to stand, that was good for a particular objective, which was, to me, that was not the idea. Moving views is adding something to the significant views. It's also saying study the places in between. But it is about trying to learn to understand, because certain things that could look bad in a static view are well understood in movement once you start moving past things. I think probably where we're all at now, that's now making it, if anything, probably more confusing than before this process started, is that we're now in a world where, because the LVMF, I don't think, gained the buy-in that was necessary, it is now just one piece of view guidance amongst many others. So there's good pieces of work being done by other agencies. I mean, there's a very obvious one is Westminster's Metropolitan Views SPD, which again is in some senses is doing exactly what I was saying at the beginning was intended, but because it doesn't exactly mesh, and it's not clear what one concept means in one versus the other. Again, the confusion is starting to mount. And unfortunately, one of the results of this is we're back in public inquiries again now. So this year is full tilt ahead, public inquiry season for the summer. So the mayor changed, and so I thought, oh well, it's all lost now. It's all going to be a big muddle again. But okay, the one that's hit the headlines is obviously the review of the protected vistas dimension, and clearly that's absolutely fine. There's certainly ones where judgments that I took 3 or 4 years ago, I think I would very happily want to revisit and look at again. I don't think it's as simple as saying let's go back to RPG 3A, though. A lot of buildings have been built since they were defined. There's a lot of things that would make that a very strange decision, I think. Back to the question I said about why we stepped off the job. should there be any more PVs? Should there be a protected vista? Should geometric protection exist for a few other things, particularly some of the World Heritage sites or St Paul's from river prospects? Because it's all got a little bit muddied, the second document, the first document could have been accused of being wordy and too big. The other one was sort of double. The new one is double the size, and because there's so many words in it, it starts to get contradictory in different places. And I think one thing that's definitely been lost is this conceptual model, and therefore any hope of that meshing with borough level guidance. I think there's absolutely a requirement to develop the significant view guidance, and obviously this is an initiative that English Heritage have taken on as well, and that's the direction that they want to go in, which is that if you're going to have significant views, you have to tell people what's significant about them. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on clarifying of moving or kinetic views. Finally, just an ongoing thing, the one bit that, as I said, was my biggest surprise when it went out for consultation was that nobody came back and said, "Yo, you've picked the wrong point for Somerset House," or "You picked the wrong point here." We were slightly loose in some of them, because some of them we just had found on a particular day a good photographic location on that day, but we hadn't revisited it 3 or 4 times. I mean, the classic example is the Cleopatra's Needle one, which we now discovered you can't go and use because it floods, because we picked one that at certain high tides you're underwater if you stand on it. So there was all sorts of reasons, but in the guidance to the draft issue, it said at the beginning, don't get too excited by these numbers, nothing's been surveyed, we're waiting your comments. And there was the claim, it will all be sorted out, it'll be surveyed, and they'll be marked, which is the important thing. But funnily enough, the one thing that nobody ever changed was, so actually what happened was the new firm of consultants simply went out, found our photographic points and surveyed them. And that's what you've got. So that some of these, I would defend to the death. Others, I think, really should have been thought about a little bit more. And they certainly should have been marked. And clearly there's an ongoing process of updating photography and so on.